Right. So, and thanks very much also to Kat as well for organizing this. Let me just share my screen. And let me just move this out of the way. Okay, right. So, so I've changed the title slightly, but it's the same talk. The title just more accurately reflects, I think, what I'm talking about. I mean, the basic thought that I want to defend is that it seems to me that in epistemology, at least, there's this widespread view that to be a virtuous person who engages who disagrees, who engages in debate, must be essentially concessive kind of person in terms of their assessment of their own opinions, and I want to counter that. I think that's wrong. So I want to put some pressure on that. What I'm going to do is I'm going to narrow things down by focusing on. I want to focus on a particular debate in the epistemology of disagreement, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, and which I think is a good way into this issue. So I'm thinking of what's called epistemic peer disagreement. So roughly, it doesn't matter that much for our purposes because I'm just treating this as a paradigm case. I think the point's meant to be quite general, but epistemic peer disagreement, I just mean by that a disagreement with someone with similar faculties to you and abilities and so forth, and with similar informational states as regards the disputed subject matter. So you and your epistemic peer are having a disagreement. What ought one to do in response to that? What is one required to do, intellectually obligated to do as a result? And it's quite standard in this literature to opt for some version of what I'm going to call conciliationism. So the idea is that you're under some obligation to downgrade your confidence in your opinions as regards to the disputed subject matter, at least temporarily. Now that downgrade can come in various different forms. It might involve a suspension of belief. It might involve a reduction in your credences. There's one kind of view says that you should split the difference with your interlocutor, which is quite a strong view. So there's a range of positions. It's a family of positions, this view that I'm calling conciliationism. But what they all share is this idea that you're under some obligation to downgrade. And you find this view defended by lots of different people: Christensen, Elgar, Feldman, Cohen, and so on. Lots of people hold this view. Non-conciliationism would then be the view that you're not under an obligation to downgrade. So you might downgrade, but you might not, right? It's a further question. And I want to defend non-conciliationism. In fact, I do defend non-conciliationism. I'm not going to be arguing for non-conciliationism today, right? At least not in toto. What I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be arguing against a particular kind of motivation for conciliationism, which I think is a bad one. That's going to be my focus. If you're interested, one of the reasons why I find, there's various reasons, one of the reasons why I find conciliationism problematic relates to some of the sort of, you might call sort of reflexive problems it has. I mean, is this familiar? Conciliationism has the drawback that it seems to apply to itself, right? Because the thesis of conciliation is itself a controversial topic. So it seems like one has to, consistently downgrade one's confidence about conciliationism. And that seems like an odd consequence of the view. Some people try and embrace that. Some people try and find principled ways of resisting that. There's a nice paper by Stuart Cohen. I don't find it persuasive, but I think it's a nice treatment of this. I can't remember what it's called, but it's a recent paper where he tries to offer a restriction of conciliation so it doesn't apply to itself in this way. In any case, what I'm interested in, though, is a particular argument for conciliationism. And in fact, maybe calling it an argument is perhaps a bit too grand, because often it's not even presented as argument. It's not unpacked at all. I think it's taken as like an obvious point in favor of conciliationism. So usually this is just presented as just an obvious point in its favor, and then we swiftly move on. And the line goes something like this: if you didn't downgrade in response to an epistemic peer disagreement, then wouldn't that indicate dogmatism on your part? And dogmatism, presumably here, at least we're led to think here, is some kind of intellectual vice, a failing of intellectual character. And if that's right, well, then it follows that you must be under some intellectual obligation to adopt a conciliatory stance, right? Because to not do that would be a sign of a failing of intellectual character, dogmatism. So I call this a dogmatic motivation for conciliationism. It looks like a pretty decisive argument in favor of the view, and I don't think it is. So what I want to be arguing for today is that I think it's perfectly fine for intellectually virtuous people to, as it were, stick to their guns and not to be conciliatory. And I think when we start to unpack what's involved here, we realize that there's a lot built into this dogmatic motivation. Okay, so let's try and unpack it a bit. I think one natural way to do this is by appealing to open-mindedness. So we think of open-mindedness as being opposed to dogmatism. And indeed, we could think of open-mindedness as being the virtue. I'll be saying more about this, the intellectual virtue that corresponds to dogmatism. Dogmatism is the corresponding intellectual vice. So to avoid that, we need to be open-minded. And we can think of open-mindedness, I think, quite naturally, as entailing a willingness to engage with different viewpoints within reason, in the process to reflect on one's own reasons for one's opinions, even if they're grounded in previous reflection. So I've got that last clause there because a lot of what we're committed to, we may not have previously reflected upon, and open-mindedness requires us to be willing to reflect upon it if called upon to do so. But I think it also demands us to be willing to reflect on things even if we've previously reflected on them, if new considerations come to light. The within reason qualification is important, particularly if you think of this as a virtue, because I tend to take the view about intellectual virtues more generally that they stand between two vices, a vice of excess and a vice of deficiency. So the vice of deficiency here would be dogmatism. The vice of excess would be being overly open-minded, so ignoring this requirement about within reason. I mean, it certainly seems like there's nothing virtuous about being open-minded as regards crazy objections. A crazy person comes in and starts coming out with crazy objections. You don't manifest your open-mindedness by taking them seriously. It's only the objections you should be taking seriously that manifest your open-mindedness. We don't need to worry too much about what that involves here, because I take it everyone would agree that epistemic peer disagreements meet this requirement. It's certainly reasonable to take the opinions of one's epistemic peers into account, right? So if they disagree with you, then this is something that one should take seriously. So that condition's easily met here. But so then you can see how this pans out. You have open-mindedness, if not an intellectual virtue, at least the kind of thing that intellectual virtuous people display. That in the face of epistemic peer disagreement would lead to conciliationism. So that's a big argument in favor of conciliationism, because if we didn't endorse conciliationism, then we'd be saying that viceful behavior is acceptable. Okay. I think there's a lacuna in this argument, or perhaps better put as a sort of hidden premise or something like that. What the argument actually demonstrates, it seems to me, if we look more carefully at what's been said, is simply the need for reflection, the need to reflect on one's own reasons and one's disputants in the appropriate cases, like epistemic peer disagreement. But that in itself is entirely compatible with retaining one's conviction in the disputed proposition, right, and to the same level as before. It doesn't follow from the mere fact that one is reflecting now. One is under an obligation to reflect on one's reasons in light of this disagreement, that therefore any downgrading has gone on. And it seems to me this is the thing that's being assumed here. It's being assumed that what would be involved in being open-minded and thereby reflecting must involve thereby a kind of downgrading. We can, I mean, I think what's being hidden here, this sort of suppressed premise, is the following thought: that if you were engaging in reflection in a way that didn't involve downgrading, that would somehow be fake, that it would somehow be, it wouldn't be genuine reflection. So I think what's been presupposed here is this thought that, open-mindedness requires reflecting on one's reasons and one's adversary's reasons. For that to be a genuine reflection, it must be accompanied by a downgrading. Otherwise, it's just a performance or something. It's just sort of going through the motions. And of course, if that's true, if it is just a performance, if it is just a going through of the motions, then that doesn't look like a manifestation of good intellectual character. So that would further reinforce this thought that there's a failing of intellectual character in play here if one doesn't downgrade. Okay, so we're going to come back to this. I think this is kind of like the million-dollar question, but I think at the very least what we've exposed here is a potential lacuna, at least. There's appeals to the intellectual virtue require reflection. It's a further question now, does reflection demand downgrading? Right? There's a line of thought we've just looked at which says, well, yes, it does if it's genuine. I want to explore the idea that we can resist that. So let's unpack a little bit more this idea of open-mindedness as an intellectual virtue. I don't think it has to be an intellectual virtue for the argument to work. It just works easier that way because you get the connection with good intellectual character directly. And it looks fairly plausible. I mean, there's certainly people have thought of open-mindedness as an intellectual virtue. I mentioned before that it has the sort of structural properties. It seems to lie between two vices. That seems plausible. A vice of excess, being overly open-minded, a vice of deficiency, dogmatism. But I think there are also some reasons to be suspicious of it as an intellectual virtue. There's various reasons, but the one that I think is most salient for our purposes is this, that it strikes me at least that one can be open-minded in a purely strategic fashion. And if that's right, then that would set it apart from intellectual virtues, because one can't be intellectually virtuous in a purely strategic fashion. That is, the intellectual virtues, at least as I and many others understand it, essentially involve a motivational component. That is, to be intellectually virtuous is to be motivated by a love of the truth, a desire for accuracy, for getting things right, and so forth. And that's got to be one's overarching motivational state. So it follows that one can't be intellectually virtuous in a purely strategic fashion for purely prudential reasons, say, because that would mean that the motivational component is lacking. Now, open-mindedness, it strikes me, it could be manifested in a purely strategic fashion. Right? Often it does go hand in hand with the motivational state, but it doesn't have to. One could think that there are strategic reasons for being open-minded. I think this comes out quite nicely in the literature on sort of philosophy of education. So the one debate there is what the overarching epistemic goals of education are. Are we focused on the intellectual virtues, or are we focused on something different, like, for example, some kind of development of critical rationality or something like that? So those of us who'd argue for the intellectual virtues view, I've argued for that. Jason Baer is another prominent defender of that, and various other people. We're arguing for the intellectual virtues precisely in this robust sense. The cultivation of intellectual character as a whole, not just traits that are useful in various ways, although they are useful, but which involve this cultivation of character where essentially has these motivational states built into it. But you could imagine a different kind of view, which says, well, no, we just want to cultivate, good sort of critical thinking, critical rationality type traits in a subject. We don't need to have this further virtuous dimension to it. I mean, this is a view very much associated with Harvey Siegel, who I see is in the audience here. Hi, Harvey. So, yeah, one of the issues here is precisely, these motivational states. Often developing the one set of traits and developing the other, they tend to go hand in hand. I mean, I'm involved in a project right now at UC Irvine where we're trying to bring the intellectual virtues into the curriculum. And a lot of what we're doing, could easily be cast as developing critical skills and so forth, because we are doing that. But what the big difference is that we're also trying to cultivate these motivational states too. But you could just teach these critical thinking skills in a prudential fashion. You could imagine teaching lawyers, let's say, to have certain critical thinking skills like open-mindedness, because it's useful to win court cases or what have you. Or you can imagine even scientists. You could say, look, being open-minded, it will make you a better scientist. Just the issues of truth and concern for the truth might drop out of the equation, or they might be secondary or something like that. So if that's right, then open-mindedness could be the kind of thing that just goes hand in hand with certain critical thinking skills. It needn't be the sort of thing that's itself an intellectual virtue. What that would suggest is that it's not open-mindedness in general that's an intellectual virtue. It's a certain kind of open-mindedness that's manifested, and that would make us think that there's a sort of other virtue in the vicinity which encompasses that aspect of open-mindedness. And indeed, I think there is. I think really what we're after here, or what the proponent of the dogmatic motivation is after, is intellectual humility, not open-mindedness, insofar as we think of the two as coming apart. So that's what I'm going to do next. I want to suggest that intellectual humility is the way to go there. And what I'm doing here is effectively I'm trying to help out the proponent of the dogmatic motivation. I'm suggesting that their position is stronger if they go directly for the intellectual virtue rather than they go via some trait that may or may not be a virtue. As we'll see later on, and I don't know if I'll have time to get into this more, there is another issue here which concerns me, which relates to the difference between open-mindedness and intellectual humility, which is that it seems to me, at any rate, that you only have to be open-minded once. If there's a particular objection and you've considered it, you don't have to, then it crops up again later. You don't have to, you're not being closed-minded by not considering it if it comes up a second time. You have to consider it the first time. That's what open-mindedness demands. But thereafter, you can ignore it. As we'll see, I think intellectual humility is actually more demanding. It does require repeat engagement. And I suspect as well that if you want to defend the dogmatic motivation, you're going to need that iterativity kind of requirement in there. So that would be another reason to go for intellectual humility rather than open-mindedness. If there's time, maybe we'll get back to that. Okay, so let's consider intellectual humility then. How might that fit? It certainly doesn't have the drawback that we just had. I mean, the thought is that this will encompass open-mindedness in the relevant sense. Intellectually humble people are open-minded in the way that we're interested in here. But it also has the motivational component built into it. You can't be just intellectually humble in a purely strategic way. I mean, if you're sort of passing yourself off with the traits of being intellectually humble, let's say because you think people will be impressed by you or something like that, well, maybe people will think you're intellectually humble, but you're not actually intellectually humble. To actually be intellectually humble is to have the appropriate motivational states that go with it. It stands in the right kind of structural relationships to the vices here, just as we were saying before. Open-mindedness might, you can be excessively humble, so that would be a vice of excess. The vice of deficiency, I think, would be a kind of intellectual arrogance, which incorporates the problematic component of dogmatism. And so the thought would be whether the kind of dogmatism that's appealed to in the dogmatic motivation for conciliationism involves a lack of intellectual humility. And so, insofar as that's right, then we have a very direct connection now to motivating a failing of intellectual character, a potential failing as being the motivation for why we should be conciliationists. I.e., if you don't downgrade, then that would be a failing of intellectual character. So we're under an intellectual obligation to downgrade. So I'm suggesting that looks like a very direct way of motivating the view. There's a problem there. There are three main ways of thinking about intellectual humility, and I'm going to be suggesting all three of them. It's not clear that we're going to get what we want to motivate the dogmatic motivation for conciliationism. So here's one way you might motivate it. I think this is the view that people, when they first start thinking about it, are very attracted to, which is you might think, well, intellectual humility just is a general kind of downgraded self-assessment. So some people have argued for this, for humility in general. It's not intellectual humility, just humility involves a kind of downgraded self-assessment. Certainly people have argued for this as regards related traits like modesty. So Julia Driver famously talks about the virtues of inaccuracy. So certain kinds of virtues which require you to have an inaccurate conception of yourself. Modesty looks like one, humility looks like one. if that's right, well, you might think, well, intellectual humility then is just the intellectual analog to that. You have a downgraded conception of your own intellectual self, your intellectual abilities, your intellectual achievements, and so on. And that looks like a very straightforward way of motivating conciliationism, of getting this dogmatic motivation through. Shouldn't one downgrade then, right? If one is intellectually humble, then of course one ought to be willing to downgrade in the light of epistemic peer disagreement. I think there are two problems with this. One problem is that I don't think the connection to the dogmatic motivation is as straightforward as it might look. I mean, after all, what we're after there is some consideration which makes us downgrade in the light of epistemic peer disagreement. So there's a particular stimulus, and now we're meant to downgrade in light of that. What we're getting instead is an entirely general impulse to downgrade, not connected to any particular stimulus. Indeed, it may even mitigate against downgrading in that particular case. And after all, you've already downgraded, right? Why should you downgrade any further, right? So actually the connection there is not clear at all. The bigger problem, though, it seems to me with this view, unlike the other two views I'm going to mention, is that it strikes me that it just isn't really a credible view of intellectual humility anyway on closer inspection. So the other two views I'm going to consider, although I favor one of them, I think they're both credible. I don't think this is really credible, which is why very few people go for it. And it relates to this. So the very idea of virtues of inaccuracy is already controversial. The idea that virtues might require inaccurate beliefs on behalf of the virtuous subject. But it's certainly implausible if you are talking about intellectual virtues. I mean, if you think intellectual virtues have this motivational component, this love of the truth, desire to get things right, how could it be that it's this excellence, this intellectual excellence of character involves having an inaccurate beliefs? That strikes me as very implausible as an account of an intellectual virtue, at least. So even if you think it's plausible about virtues more generally, I don't think it's very plausible about intellectual virtues. So this kind of way of thinking about intellectual humility is problematic here. It's problematic both in its own right, and I think problematic as a way of motivating the dogmatic motivation for conciliationism. Here's another view. This is the view which most people hold. It's not my view, but not the view that I endorse, but the view actually, which I think is fairly standard now. Intellectual humility doesn't involve inaccurate beliefs. It involves what's often called owning one's limitations or owning one's fallibility. So the idea is you have a correct assessment of your intellectual achievements and cognitive abilities, not an inaccurate one. But in virtue of having a correct, so the thought is many people don't have a correct conception. The intellectually humble person does, because in having a correct conception of it, they thereby recognize their inherent intellectual limitations, their fallibility, and so on, and they act accordingly. This has become sort of the industry standard view now. There's a paper defending this famous paper, which has the authors, Dennis Whitcomb, Heather Battley, Jason Bear, and Howard Snyder, I forget his first name. So the fact that there's four authors, it's almost like it has this imprimatur, it's like the sort of industry stamp, the epistemologists have got together and we've agreed this is the view. And lots of people endorse it. I'm not going to evaluate it. I think it has some problems. Well, I'll mention one problem in a moment. But let's think, does it give us what we want in terms of the dogmatic motivation? I'm not sure it does. I mean, think about it. What would be involved in recognizing one's fallibility? Excuse me. Recognizing one's inherent intellectual limitations. That might well demand reflection in the context of epistemic peer disagreement. Why would it necessarily involve downgrading? There doesn't seem to be any straight entailment there at all. You can, to recognize it is to say, well, I should think something more about this. I should reflect on this. It doesn't seem to follow, therefore, that one engages in downgrading. Right? That seems to be a further step. I don't think it follows from the view at all. I also think the view has some independent problems. And I just want to mention one, because this is the problem that I think makes me most concerned about it, which is how it deals with people who are intellectually superior and know they're intellectually superior. I mean, it's possible that there could be people who, particularly as regards a certain subject matter, like scientists or what have you, they're way more superior than everyone else. They're way less fallible than everyone else. Their limitations are much more limited compared to everyone else, and they know this. I remember this is a view in which you're not meant to have an accurate conception of self, but accurate. What would prevent such a person from being condescending towards those around them? There doesn't seem any reason why they shouldn't be. After all, they can own their limitations, own their fallibility in a way that's entirely consistent with being condescending to those around them. But that doesn't seem to be what the intellectually humble person would do. It seems even intellectually superior people ought to be intellectually humble, right? And I think this is a big problem with the view. I don't think it tells the right story about what intellectually superior people should do. And yet, I think we think of them. I think the right way to think about intellectually superior people actually is as virtuous and therefore as having humility. Okay, so let me mention the third and final view, which is, for what it's worth, the view that I favor, which is the non-egotist account of intellectual humility. So this has been defended by various people. Robertson Woods have a version of this. Maura Priest has a version, as Andrew Tannasini. I also defend this. It seems to me that the intellectual humility is best thought of as having another regarding component to it, a non-egotistical component to it. So what it involves is, a love and concern for the truth, which manifests itself thereby in a love and concern for arguments and for other epistemic agents, and a respect and concern for them thereby. So it manifests itself in certain characteristic other regarding dispositions: openness to other people's viewpoints, willingness to listen to counter evidence, and so on, where these are all rooted in a love for the truth. And I think this gives us the right kind of result as regards the intellectually superior person. They have, insofar as they're intellectually humble, they might perfectly well recognize that they are superior and they know more about this than those around them. But it would manifest itself in a kind of respect for others and a patience with others and a willingness to go over again and again with the issues. I have Ernie Souza here. You may have recognized Souza, the image, very prominent epistemologist. I have him there because it seems like it's a good kind of example of this. Very intellectually humble individual, but also, way more, way superior in terms of his expertise in epistemology than just about everybody around him. But to engage with Ernie Souza is to engage with someone who manifestly does know way more than everybody else and has thought about these things way more than everybody else, but who nonetheless is very interested in what everyone else is saying, will patiently go over again, probably to the nth time, the very same objection that they've heard many, many times before. And that's how they exhibit their intellectual humility. So it's those kind of other regarding traits which I think display the intellectual humility. What's interesting though there, notice when we think of the Ernie Souzas or any kind of wise agent in this guise who has intellectual humility, I don't think we think of them as conceding anything, right? I don't think Ernie concedes anything. And why should he? It's far more about these things than those around him. The intellectual humility doesn't manifest itself, it seems to me, in a concessive attitude. It manifests itself precisely in that respectful, engaging attitude. And there's nothing fake about it either. It's rooted in a love of the truth, right? That's what intellectual humility is. It doesn't necessarily involve any kind of concessive attitude. I think the same is true on the owning your limitations view. I think you can make a similar point there. But I think it's very clear on the non-egotistical view. Recognizing, at least in the superior, in the case where you're superior about the subject matter, you can still manifest intellectual humility without conceding anything. And I think once we've understood that point as it applies as regards someone who's intellectually superior, we can see how it would apply in the case of peer disagreement too. To be intellectually humble is to be willing to reflect, to engage. You might downgrade. You may be prompted to do that, but you might not. Right? It doesn't require. What's required of you is to take seriously that there's an issue here and that there's something that requires reflection. Moreover, insofar as that it genuinely is intellectual humility, that it's rooted in this love for the truth, well then there wouldn't be anything fake about this. So going back to this issue of the whether reflection is non-genuine or fake, unless it involves downgrading, it strikes me that that doesn't work. So I think we've got three views. On all three views of intellectual humility, I don't think you get what you want in terms of motivation for for conciliationism. I think on the most plausible view, which is the non-egotistical view, you especially don't get that kind of motivation. I think the non-egotistical view gives us an explanation, I think, gives us a way of understanding how intellectual virtue here of the relevant kind might involve reflection without it thereby involving downgrading. It gives us a nice way of seeing that. But I think on all the views we have of intellectual humility, we have a way of thinking about it, the virtuous trait, such that it doesn't necessarily involve downgrading. Right? You can be intellectually virtuous without downgrading, and thus there isn't any failing of intellectual character in not downgrading. Let me just say a little bit more about this. I guess I've kind of covered this already, but so what I'm suggesting is, at the very least on the non-egotistical account, but I think it follows even on the other plausible account too, the reflection that's involved so it's not just any kind of reflection on the evidence that counts. It has to be a virtuous reflection, it has to be a reflection that's rooted in a genuine concern for the truth and so forth. But the idea is that one can manifest that without thereby involving any downgrading, right? So there's a way in which you can stick to one's guns without thereby being dogmatic or exhibiting intellectual bias. So I think properly understood, when that objection from before about how the reflection is somehow fake, mere performance, that doesn't go through. It might, if it is a mere performance, then it wouldn't be virtuous. But there is a kind of virtuous reflection which isn't fake. Now I'm nearly done. I just want to make one more point, just because this is in the abstract, and this is a bit more tentative, because I realized that if I wanted to cover this properly, I'd probably be another talk as well. So I don't want to do that. So I'm just going to mention this as I'll throw this in as a further point, a generalization. So what I've been arguing for is this idea that I want to counter what I think is a prevailing view, that virtuous disagreement involves concession. I think lots of people hold that, and I think that's wrong. That's what I've been talking about. I think that view actually goes hand in hand with a broader view, which again I think is widely held, which is roughly the lines that inquiry itself is in a sense concessive, at least to the following degree. The genuine inquiry is rooted in doubt. So Jane Friedman, in a series of papers recently, has defended this, and lots of people find this persuasive, and I don't. I think there is ways of pursuing genuine inquiry that don't involve doubt. And a related point, which is made even more widely, is that knowledge is an inquiry stopper. You find this in Williamson, and lots of people who follow the sort of Williamson line. That there's something, there's something's gone wrong, as it were, as if you carry on inquiring after you know the answer. So inquiring about what you know is somehow incoherent. But again, I think this is wrong. And you can see how both of them involve a kind of concession. You have to think that you haven't quite got things right in order to inquire. Either you doubt, or at the very least you don't think you know, which I guess implies a kind of doubt. You don't think you've established the facts of the matter. I mean, I would want to grant that, yes, in general, inquiry often is like that. It's stimulated by doubt. There's lots of very straightforward inquiries, I think, where they do end when you know the answer. But it doesn't strike me there's anything in the very nature of inquiry that it'd be like that. I think you can inquire about things where there's no doubt. I think you can inquire about things where you think you already know the answer. And indeed, I think reflecting on the intellectually virtuous subject, as we've done during this talk, I think indicates how that might work and why it might work that way. Intellectually virtuous subjects, I think, certainly where the subject matter is complex or controversial, maybe the kind of subjects who would be inclined to, as it were, to be predisposed to return to topics. They may be stimulated to return to topics, even though they don't doubt them, they have no new doubts have arisen, even though about the specific propositions in play, even though relatedly they take themselves still to have knowledge of the specific propositions. Rather, they manifest their intellectual humility in terms of a willingness to re-engage. Now, of course, there are two ways you could respond to this. One way would be to say, oh, yeah, but that's not really inquiry, right? That must be something else. I'm not sure how sustainable that is. It looks very theory driven to me. I mean, it's a kind of activity which is truth directed, which might lead to a change in one's mind, right? I mean, it's not a foregone conclusion that you won't change your mind by going through this process. It's the kind of process that might convince others, for example. So it looks to me like hard to sustain how that wouldn't be inquiry, unless one has already had some, as I say, theory driven. You've got some prior theoretical commitment to thinking that inquiry has to be construed more narrowly. Another way to go is to think that it is inquiry. I can imagine someone saying, well, yes, but what that shows is that inquiry isn't just about getting at the truth. It must be about something else. Or at least sometimes it can be about something else, getting certainty, getting understanding or something. But I don't know that. I don't think I'd want to resist that too. It seems to me that the kind of virtuous subject we're considering, they precisely are caring about the truth. That's why they're doing it. So if we think that caring about the truth excludes this kind of activities, then I think that must mean that we've got a too narrow conception of what it is to care about the truth. Okay, so I'll leave it there. I just wanted to throw that in as I think there's a more pervasive trend in epistemology which relates certain kinds of activities, of certain kind of disagreement, inquiry, and ties them essentially to concessive approaches. And that's what, in general, I'm trying to resist. Okay, so to conclude, I mean, the main thing I've been arguing for is against this dogmatic motivation for conciliationism. I think if that motivation held, then that would be a pretty decisive count in favor of the view. I don't think it holds. As I say, you might have independent reasons for endorsing conciliationism. I think there are independent reasons not to, but I'm just focusing on that one constraint. I don't think it holds. I think we can make sense of how virtuous subjects could be non-dogmatic, open-minded, intellectually humble, and so forth, and yet not be concessive. And I think this is especially clear on the most plausible way of understanding the view, which is in terms of intellectual humility and the account of intellectual humility that I favor, the non-egotistic view. I think that makes very clear that there's a kind of virtuous reflection which wouldn't essentially involve downgrading. And if you're Curb fans, by the way, that's Larry David there. I think the character, at any rate, he's open-minded, but he's not virtuously so. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Duncan. That was splendid. So I'll stop the recording and